Sorry for the shorter break, but if we want to keep the regular 2-hour schedule, we should get back at it again. We try to keep the 2-hour schedule. These ones are difficult. I'll admit, poetry and wisdom are difficult to get through in the allotted time because they are probably the most foreign of the genres, foreign to what we deal with on a cultural daily basis. So there's kind of a lot that goes into it. And I kind of just touched the tip of the iceberg with the poetry stuff. Like you probably know from if you've done the reading from Fee and then from Grasping God's Word, there's a lot to be able to go over there. Wisdom is also kind of similar. So with that, let's kind of get into part 2 now of talking about wisdom from the Old Testament. What is Hebrew wisdom? What do I mean when I say Hebrew wisdom literature? Well, when you're thinking about this word wisdom, especially from the Hebrew, the Old Testament point of view, the way Fee summarizes it, and I think I put the note there from page 206, wisdom is the ability to make godly choices in life. Now, wisdom can be expressed in very black and white statements, like in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom can also be expressed in highly poetic statements, like in the books of Ecclesiastes and Job, and even the Song of Solomon. Now, not everyone agrees that the Song of Solomon is necessarily wisdom per se, but Fee included it in his list of wisdom books, and so I put it there as well for you to think about. But wisdom is essentially, when thinking about it from the biblical Hebrew point of view, the ability to make godly choices in life. So wisdom is meant to be highly practical. So when we say the word wisdom as it relates to the Bible and the way the Bible uses wisdom, we aren't just thinking about intellect. So a wise person isn't simply someone who knows a lot. A wise person is someone who is able to live a godly life consistently, making choices that would be pleasing to God. That's what we mean by wisdom. And so wisdom literature, or books of the Bible like Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, these are books that are going to try to explain to us how to live a life of wisdom. So you'll have a book like the book of Proverbs, for example, which will give you more rules and regulations to live this sensible life. If you live according to these rules, according to the book of Proverbs, you can expect an abundant, fruitful life. Job and Ecclesiastes remind us this isn't always the case. Just because you follow these wisdom rules doesn't necessarily mean you'll always have an abundant, fruitful life. But the book of Proverbs shows us that usually, or normally speaking, if you live by these rules in the book of Proverbs, you can expect to have an abundant and full life. Now, it's also important to realize that these points of wisdom from the book of Proverbs in particular, they aren't guarantees from God. If you do something in such and such a way, you must necessarily get this particular outcome. Wisdom says, normally speaking, if you live this kind of life, you can expect blessing and abundance. So for example, in Proverbs Chapter 22, verse 6, it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." It's important to remember that in the wisdom books, we're dealing with what typically will happen, not promises for what must happen. So when the book of Proverbs says, train up a child in the way he should go, when he's old, he'll never depart from it, the book of Proverbs is not promising you that if you impart biblical truth to your child, he will grow up and for sure become a Christian. The book of Proverbs is not promising that. But the book of Proverbs is saying, generally speaking, if you give a child tools for what they need to live life, they will grow up and utilize those good tools. In fact, Proverbs 22 is more in the context of living an effective life or living a life where you're helping to sustain yourself and your family and contribute to society. So in other words, train up a child in how to live life, and they'll always have those tools. They'll go with them forever. And it's not a promise that the child will have faith in Christ. So remember, the book of these wisdom books are not promises or guarantees, but they're truthful ways to live that will normally, under normal circumstances, typically take place. Book of Ecclesiastes is a really interesting wisdom book because it's wisdom from the cynic's point of view. The book of Ecclesiastes talks about meaninglessness in life. And you might think, why does the Bible talk about meaninglessness when we know that life has a lot of meaning? And we know that God fills our life with great joy, even in the midst of distress and pain, and that God brings lots of meaning to our life. And we know that since we're going to live with Him forever, well, we have great purpose. Why would the book of Ecclesiastes then talk about meaninglessness from a cynical point of view? Well, remember that not all wisdom is going to be as black and white as the book of Proverbs. It's not always going to be as easy as follow these rules. The book of Ecclesiastes is so cynical, but for a point. The author is intentionally painting a stark picture to prove to us that life without God is in fact meaningless. Now, you cannot study the book of Ecclesiastes one verse at a time. You can really only know what the point of the book of Ecclesiastes is by seeing it in its entirety. Because if you were to only take a couple of verses here and there, for instance, if you went to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 2, famous verse used all the time, where he says, there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. I've heard many Christians describe that verse as, well, God is sovereign over everything. Therefore, you can have faith, well, that God is in control when you're born and He's in control when you die. That's a truthful thing to say, but the author of Ecclesiastes isn't making that point with verse 2. What is he doing? If you know the whole context of the book of Ecclesiastes, he's telling us that it's as meaningless to be born as it is to die. All of us are born and all of us die. Such is life. He's trying to say how futile life is. It doesn't matter if you're born into wealth, riches, health, or sickness. You are eventually going to die anyway. So everybody's the same. Everything is meaningless in this life. Verse 2 is meant to be very hopeless. On the contrary, Christians have, over the course of many generations, used verses like that, cherry picking from the book of Ecclesiastes, to say all these pleasant, nice things. Well, that's not what the purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes was. So you might think, well, why does it exist in the scriptures? Well, it exists because it's meant to show us how futile human wisdom is, how futile the ways of the world are. If all we have is this life, then yep, everything's meaningless. But the author of Ecclesiastes at the very end is going to kind of tip his hand and show his cards a little bit, because he says, what is the only really meaningful thing you can do? Fear God and keep His commandments. So then the book of Ecclesiastes is so cynical, but it's cynical for a reason. If the words of the cynic reach the ears of a fool, the fool is going to hear those words and think, yep, he's right. There's no point in living. Life is meaningless. It's all useless. I should just go and live however I want. The words of Ecclesiastes will reach the fool, and he'll go on and live all the more foolishly. But the words of Ecclesiastes, when they reach the ears of a wise person, they'll think, there's something not right here. And that's the point. The wisdom of Ecclesiastes is to show us that if all you're looking for is satisfaction in this world, you will not find it. You can only find any kind of hope and satisfaction if you are putting your trust in your Creator, who is your God. So you need the whole book of Ecclesiastes. It only works as a piece of wisdom literature if you're taking it all in together. It's kind of like when Solomon, you remember when Solomon had those two ladies, those two moms come to him because the one mother had lost her child in the night and the other mother had her child, her baby, and they were fighting over whose it was because the one mother stole it from the other mother. And they came before Solomon to give judgment. And they both fought over the baby, saying it was both theirs. And so what did Solomon say? We're going to cut it in half. Now, if this was wisdom according to the book of Proverbs, you would say that's not wisdom at all, right? Like taking innocent life, that's not wise. So the book of Proverbs would speak very black and white wisdom and say, nope, that's not what you should have done, Solomon. But see, what Solomon did was actually very wise in accordance with ancient Hebrew practice. He did something very cynical. And in his cynicism, about to cut a child in half, terrible thing to do, in his cynicism, the cynic revealed who the other cynic was, the false mother. But the cynicism also revealed who the true mother was as well. Because the true mother said, no, don't do life like that, Solomon. Don't kill the baby, keep it alive. That's really the way of joy. And so Ecclesiastes operates in much the same way. It's cynicism, it's wisdom, cynical wisdom to the fool who will be confirmed in foolishness. But it will land on the ears of the wise, and the wise will say, that's not quite right. There's something more than what Ecclesiastes is saying. And that's the whole point of that form of wisdom. The book of Job does something kind of similar, but from a different angle. Wisdom in the form of dialogue. Lengthy dialogue between Job and three of his friends, plus a fourth who shows up a little bit later. Much of the book of Job contains wrong advice. And if you've read the book of Job, you know this. His friends give him essentially bad advice. So again, if you were to try to preach or teach the book of Job or study it on your own and only cherry pick a few verses here and there, you're liable to pick a passage from the book of Job that's actually bad advice, the opposite of wisdom. So you can't just take the book of Job as one chapter here and one chapter there. You need to know its entirety or else you're going to be lost. So the bad advice is for a reason. The bad advice is meant to show us that the wisdom of these so-called friends around Job, even when it looks like good advice, the wisdom of the world pales in comparison to the wisdom of God. The book of Job is meant to cause us to fall on our knees like Job and be confident in one thing alone, the sovereign righteousness of God, not in ourselves and not in the wisdom of this world. So the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Job show us wisdom from a highly poetic point of view, a very profound point of view. The book of Proverbs is much easier because there are these little nuggets of truth that are much more straightforward in black and white. The books of Ecclesiastes and Job show us wisdom when things don't go exactly the way you thought they should. What's the purpose of wisdom literature? Well, much of the Old Testament, which deals with the law and the prophets and the narrative, much of the Old Testament tells us what to believe and how to obey. The books of wisdom, though, inform us in a different way. The books of wisdom call us to think, not just to believe and obey, as important as that is. The books of wisdom call us to listen, look, think, and reflect for the purpose of developing godly character to make wise choices. So when you come to the book of Proverbs, you should think, this book is making me think and reflect on how my character can develop so that I can make a wise choice. When you come to the book of Job or Ecclesiastes, same thing. Even though it's highly poetic, this book is meant to make me think and reflect on how I can make wise choices concerning the righteousness of God, concerning His sovereignty, concerning the worldviews and the wisdom of this world, which I know is fruitless. Again, all of these books are meant to contribute to our wise decision making. So if we kind of think about then those wisdom books in relation to the bigger picture of the Old Testament, within the covenant community of Israel, the wisdom literature calls God's people to consider, how are you going to faithfully live out God's covenant in a world that isn't always black and white? Now, the law is going to tell you this is right and this is wrong. But what happens when you get yourself into situations where you're not always going to find a yes or no answer? The wisdom books were meant to help the people of Israel keep being faithful to God in all of the multiple various experiences of life that they would face. Some of these things would be very straightforward, hence the book of Proverbs. But other experiences of life would be very difficult to grapple with, like the pain of loss, uncertainty, asking, why is God doing what he's doing, like the book of Job? Why do some people succeed who are wicked? The book of Ecclesiastes. So these wisdom books were meant to give us some answers for how to live life even when things don't seem to match our expectations. So wisdom, not just in the easy things of life, but in the difficult things of life. So it's raining quite hard now, isn't it? Let's talk about some common misunderstandings when it comes to wisdom literature. First of all, there's three that I want to point out. First of all, we can misunderstand wisdom literature when we fail to follow the author's complete line of thought. And I've already kind of touched on that a little bit. For instance, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. If you don't know the entire flow of thought of the book of Ecclesiastes and you just cherry pick and pull that verse out, I mean, you could essentially make that verse say the exact opposite for what it's actually saying. You could put a nice, warm, fuzzy, flowery feel on that verse when in fact it's a very harsh, desperate, and hopeless verse when you know the context of meaninglessness. So you need to know the whole author's complete line of thought, and Christians need to be careful not to take those little pithy statements within some of those books like Ecclesiastes and Job and build theology and doctrine on things without knowing the full line of thought. Again, you could go to the book of Job and find bad advice intentionally put there in the Bible. And if all you took were those couple verses of bad advice, I wouldn't be helpful at all, would it? Unless you knew the bigger picture of why that was there to begin with. Number two, misunderstandings can happen in wisdom literature when we don't know what terms mean, or when we don't quite understand what the Bible means when it uses certain terms. So for example, in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 7, it says this: "Leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge." Leave the presence of a fool. What does it mean to be a fool? If we don't know what it means to be a fool, we might assume that what the Bible's telling us is that someone who's not as intelligent as me, I need to have no association with. Is the Bible necessarily talking about intelligence when it's talking about the fool? Well, actually, not at all. In the context of the book of Proverbs, a foolish person is somebody who doesn't believe God, someone who's rebellious to God. So you could be a very, very smart intellectual person and still be a fool. I'm sure you know some in your own lives. Then you could also have someone who's not very intelligent at all, but be very, very wise because they know the Lord and they follow Him and they make wise decisions about godliness in their life. So when Proverbs says, leave the presence of a fool, it's saying, don't hold close associations with people who want nothing to do with God. They won't be able to help you come to know God any better. So again, it's not saying leave the presence of people who are more simple-minded. It's not saying that at all. Or people who are mentally handicapped or something like this. It's saying, leave the presence of someone who is in rebellion against God. Completely different message, of course. So you need to know your terms. How does the book of Proverbs use the word wisdom? How does it use the word fool and other things? And then thirdly, something to be aware of. There's lots of poetry within wisdom, the wisdom books. So when you come across poetry in wisdom literature, don't forget to utilize rules for interpreting poetry. For instance, in Job chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, "Oh, that my vexations were weighed," or "Oh, that my troubles were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash." So verse 2 is actually parallelism. "Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balance." Synonymous parallelism. He's essentially saying, my troubles can't be weighed. They're so great, you would never be able to measure them. He's using two lines to say the exact same thing. And then he says, "For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea," which obviously can't be weighed. It's too much for any human to do that. "Therefore my words have been rash." So some developmental parallelism going on. So there's poetry going on in the book of Job. It's important to see how that poetry works itself out. He's not literally saying that his troubles can't be weighed. He's using figurative imagery, of course, to describe something, an experience that goes beyond words. And then, of course, he's going to meet with God, and God's going to help bring him to terms with some of those experiences that he had. So there's lots of poetry within wisdom. Look out for it and watch for it. And that'll help us minimize some misunderstandings that can take place with wisdom that is very, very old and ancient, but still very applicable to us today. So then, what are some rules for interpreting wisdom literature? Let's talk about 3 rules again. Rule number 1. Connect the text to the author's line of thought in the book. Now, we've done this, of course. Hopefully that pattern should be notable. Whenever we do context or ask questions about the historical literary context, we're kind of doing this very thing. But when it comes to wisdom, it's, as you've hopefully seen in some of those little mini examples, it's oh so important to be able to take any given verse or statement by the author and be able to connect it to the bigger line of thought. And in the book of Job, if you came across one of his friends who is giving not so good advice, you would want to connect that with the bigger picture and not just take it as a standalone statement of truth. In the book of Proverbs, for example, there are 3 distinct sections in the book of Proverbs. And the bigger section, chapter 10 through 29, is kind of the more traditional section that we kind of know when we think about the book of Proverbs, with all of these little nuggets of truth listed one after the other. So you need to kind of know what section you're in. You need to know how those sections fit together so that you can understand what kind of point the author's trying to make. Again, that kind of has to do more with just knowing the context and all of that. But as it relates to wisdom literature, it's kind of even more crucial, because especially when you're dealing with books like Ecclesiastes and Job and Song of Solomon, if you can't trace the thought of the author throughout the book, you're going to have a really, really hard time coming to proper theological conclusions later on in your interpretation. So connect the text, whatever verses you're dealing with, to the author's line of thought throughout the whole book, Ask, what is the author trying to accomplish in this section of writing? So that's connecting the text to the author's line of thought. Secondly, second rule, identify any forms of poetry. And deal with any kind of figurative language, parallelism, using some of the rules that we talked about for poetry. Try to identify those forms. And then again, put yourself in the author's shoes, visualize, be able to kind of feel what they were trying to feel or convey. And then lastly, as with all of the other Old Testament genres, connect the wisdom theology with New Testament teaching. Try to see how the New Testament also further reveals that theological point that the author was making. How did I say it over here? So connect wisdom theology to New Testament teaching, if possible. Because I think, as you're going to see in the example in a few moments, there tend to be a lot of ways the New Testament also speaks, further explains wisdom to us that the Old Testament initially gives. So connect wisdom to the New Testament teachings. There's a couple of notes, one in particular you need to be aware of. Oftentimes in wisdom literature, the author will talk about how when you live a wise life, make good decisions, your wisdom will be connected to wealth, being blessed by God with material things. And that's ultimately because in the Old Covenant, God did materially bless his people as they lived wise, godly lives. We need to be careful, though, because as we move into the New Testament, what we're going to see is some of those Old Covenant promises about land and inheritance, they are not necessarily changed, but I guess we can say it, they are changed in a way because God fulfills them not just simply through material blessing, but through spiritual, eternal blessing. And so instead of simply giving us material things through our wisdom, God blesses us in deeper, spiritual, and eternal ways. So the New Testament reveals that quite often the Christian is going to walk through life and make wise decisions and maybe not experience all the wealth and prosperity that they see others enjoying around them. Yet they are to know and understand that God is giving them something even greater. As they live a wise life and follow God faithfully, he's going to bless them with something that goes beyond the material goods of the world. So that's one clear difference you should ultimately note. You're going to come across that a lot in the wisdom books. The author will talk about, especially in the book of Proverbs, if you keep your ways pure, you will be blessed and have material things of this world. It can happen that the Christian lives a wise life and is blessed with material things, but ultimately the New Testament points to the fact that when you live a wise life, you will be given something even greater than those material goods of the world. So keep that in mind as well when you're connecting wisdom theology to the New Testament. And so let's look at this exercise from Proverbs chapter 15. If you have your Bibles there, you want to turn over to Proverbs 15. Try to run through this one rather quickly. And I think because it's the book of Proverbs, it'll be a little bit more straightforward. Someone who's found Proverbs chapter 15, would you go ahead and read that verse, just verse 1? Soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Pretty straightforward piece of wisdom. So again, let's work through our system. Context. Again, because this verse is kind of embedded within a series of proverbial truth statements, probably not a whole lot of historical context that we need to deal with. We don't really see words or images that are maybe more culturally important. That what I'm trying to say is verse 1 kind of meets us in our culture where we're at as well. So there's not as many terms that we're unfamiliar with, particularly since it's only one verse as well. So the historical context doesn't really need to be dealt with a whole lot. Maybe just to say we need to be mindful of the fact that traditionally we understand that this is a message from King Solomon, right, to his son or sons. And so the context of many of these messages would have been in the situation of ruling a nation. So a soft answer turns away anger or wrath. In the context of trying to lead people, rule people, run these meetings, committee meetings, right, so to speak. Now, not, this verse is not just for leaders, of course, just like the book of Proverbs is not just for princes and politicians, although there was very important historical significance to the book of Proverbs that way. That's probably maybe the most we could say about the historical context of verse 1 just now. So probably more important then is just going to be the literary, kind of like we dealt with earlier. So by literary we mean where do we find chapter 15, verse 1 in the book of Proverbs? Well, Proverbs, again, is a book about rules for wise living. That's the big picture of the book of Proverbs. But what section do we find the book of Proverbs? There are 3 sections to the book of Proverbs. Section 1 is Proverbs 1 to 9, and those are kind of more lengthy explanations about different circumstances for how to pursue wisdom. And then section 2 is chapter 10 through 29. And in that section, we kind of just find a lot of rapid-fire nuggets of proverbial truth, oftentimes with parallelism within the Hebrew poetry structure. And then section number 3, coming to the end, right, with chapter 30 and 31, we kind of have a slightly different style where we have the wise woman and what it means to pursue a godly wife and what a godly wife might look like. And so we have something slightly different right at the very end of the book of Proverbs, but we're dealing with section 2 since we're in chapter 15, which means we can expect to find these proverbial truths. Section 2. Whoops. Proverbial truths. Something to keep in mind with this particular section is there isn't really a strict flow of thought per se, right? You're not necessarily going to find lots of different arguments within the text. Like the book of Job, you're going to find a clear flow of thought. Section number 2 of Proverbs, we find more kind of rapid-fire clusters of truth, short 2-line parallelisms, and these Proverbs typically stand by themselves, right? So we could say that about section 2. Typically stand by themselves. Now, within the Bible, this is probably one of the few, if only, times you're going to be able to make this kind of statement about the text. That you're going to find verses that you could literally lift from the text kind of on their own, and they work on their own. Now, in chapter 15, we still find, interestingly enough, a bunch of clusters of numerous proverbs telling us similar things about how to speak gently with people and seek healing in relationship. So we find that as well, right? We find within, this section, chapter 15 is kind of surrounded by other proverbs on speech. Again, what you're going to find in this section, chapters 10 through 29, are lots of standalone proverbs. It's kind of unique that in chapter 15 we find a bunch of similarly clustered proverbs together about speech. But the literary and historical context is rather simple to kind of identify with this particular verse. If we were dealing with the book of Job, we'd have to do a lot more work to trace the flow of thought. And same with Ecclesiastes. Yeah, kind of using a simpler example, because here in the book of Proverbs, we don't need to trace the flow of thought so much. We know it's a book about rules for living a wise life, making wise decisions. We know it's in a section where there are standalone proverbs where we can kind of take that one verse and deal with it kind of on its own, even though it is kind of clustered around some other proverbs that deal with speech. That's a little bit about the context. It's not hard to see, if we were to summarize what this verse is about, that the verse is speaking about how our speech needs to be gentle rather than harsh. Gentle speech turns away wrath, harsh words stir up anger. Seems fairly straightforward. So, number 2, then, when we turn to look for some theology or theological principle, fortunately, there aren't really any forms of poetry in this particular verse. So we don't have to go down the road of trying to identify those forms of poetry per se. Again, we're kind of just dealing with some very straightforward pieces of truth, which is somewhat more rare in the Old Testament, but here we have a good example of it for us tonight anyway. So fortunately, there's no real forms of poetry that we have to deal with. Speaking softly or gently tends to be a very straightforward principle. It results in peacefulness, whereas speaking harsh words tend to result in anger and conflict. So connecting the author's line of thought seems pretty straightforward. Gentle words lead to less wrath or minimal wrath, maybe even no wrath, whereas harsh words stir up anger. That's kind of the flow of thought contained right there in that one verse. We don't really need to identify any forms of poetry, so rule number 2 kind of almost gets to be sidestepped for us. There aren't really even any figures of speech for us to deal with there. But then we should try to connect the wisdom theology with New Testament teaching. So what's a way we could kind of summarize maybe a theological principle from that one short verse? What's one way you might summarize it in your own words? Okay, so speak in love or gently to avoid angry conflict. Could be one way to, we could use other words if we wanted, right? It's a very short verse. The verse itself almost explicitly states the kind of theology from it. It's a very simple piece of proverb we're dealing with. But again, to work through the process, speak in love, speak gently to avoid angry conflict. Could be one way of restating the truth of that verse. But now let's connect it to some New Testament thoughts as well. And fortunately, the New Testament speaks a great deal to this very truth. So for instance, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. Put that one up there. Ephesians 4:15 says, "Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Colossians 4:6. Colossians 4:6 says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." 1 Timothy 4:12. Now, by the way, if you have computer software, connecting the Old Testament to the New Testament is a much quicker process, because oftentimes you can do word searches and try to connect some of those thoughts that you saw from the Old Testament into the New Testament. And that's simply what I did for this particular exercise. I was able to kind of type in speech, and graciousness, and love, and be able to get a whole bunch of verses pop up. And the few that I'm kind of giving you now are just, like I said, a few of the many that came up. But 1 Timothy 4:12 says, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." And then probably some of the more famous passages here in the book of James, James 1:19 and 20. Which says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God." And then James 3:6, which says, "The tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell." Now, each one of these verses is explaining or further explaining to us the power of speech, not telling us in exactly the same words as the Proverbs, but connecting the wisdom of the Old Testament with further instruction from the New Testament. So these can be helpful in further seeing the theology that lies behind the wisdom, and then helping us even apply it in various sorts of ways. Because I think one of the things that ends up happening in the Old Testament, the Old Testament Proverbs can be a little bit more vague on how to apply certain situations like this to us. So for instance, a soft answer turns away wrath. That could be used in all sorts of situations. Maybe numerous ones come to your mind immediately. But then the New Testament also kind of further explains and helps us realize that the Christian is called to speak the truth in love, have your speech seasoned with grace, with salt, to be able to bring life to people rather than tear them down and rip them apart. Young people are encouraged to set an example of good speech. Now, I'm sure older ones should give examples of good speech too, but interesting that the New Testament centers out the young, to say young people should particularly be thinking about giving a good example of speech. I mean, how applicable is that for us today? I mean, older people can certainly get their mouths get away from them at times, but how many young people get caught up in saying things they shouldn't say or being disrespectful in ways they shouldn't? And the New Testament, the Bible itself, in conjunction with the Old Testament, helps young people particularly understand how important their words actually are. I'm just thinking of all these plethoras of applications, even as it relates to social media. How these little tiny words that can be harsh and cruel stir up wrath and anger and violence and disputes that are unnecessary. Whereas gentle answers, seasoned with grace and love, produce something much, much different. Healing and turn away wrath. So, those are a whole bunch of maybe verses you could use to kind of link to the New Testament. But then lastly, we would just want to make some application to this particular piece of wisdom. Soft answer turns away wrath, a harsh word stirs up anger. What are some ways we could apply this to our lives even today? I know it seems like the verse itself just tells us it's straightforward. Personally, though, or in our culture and day, what are some ways that that verse could really hit home? Done. Workplace. Neighbors. So I think I'm doing that right. Neighbors. Church family, I mean, absolutely. New Testament is just replete with examples of that. Yeah. Yep. So just little community interactions. Family. Marriage. Yeah, how true. So many. And then, I mean, let's not forget about a king giving a lesson to a prince. Leaders. I mean, how many politicians, rulers, leaders fail to get this verse right? Not just in the Christian world, but like in all sorts of worlds, right? Like so leadership. And we probably have lots of examples of leaders we could put forward as bad examples for how to stir up anger and conflict rather than using the wisdom of Solomon to turn away wrath. So again, we can see how one little verse in connection with the New Testament can have so many little tiny points of application. And then in your own lives, as you're interacting with people, real people, relationships, or you go online and you read something and you're tempted to respond in some way, shape, or form, thinking about, well, what does the way of wisdom tell me? As a Christian, I ought to be known for my truthfulness, but I also equally need to be known for the way I express my truthfulness. Peaceable in speech. A Christian that stirs up strife and anger with harsh words is just blatantly unwise and foolish according to the Bible's definition and does not really represent the character of Christ. And so the Christian needs to be thinking about these, or that in particular, when they're thinking about wisdom. One aspect of wisdom for our lives is the way we conduct our speech. Okay, that is our little exercise in the wisdom literature. Any thoughts or questions before we conclude today? I've written down a few chapters there for you to be reading and how to read the Bible for all it's worth, chapter 7 and 13, as we talk about the Gospels and about Apocalypse next week. And think about those quiz questions as well. And no extra handout reading for today, so that's all. And we just bow in a word of prayer, and we can be dismissed. Well, Father in heaven, Lord, again, we thank you for bringing us through yet another lecture. And Lord, my prayer and hope is that whatever I've said tonight would have been beneficial and helpful in us seeing and knowing you in your word. And if anything was confusing, Father, I pray for clarity in the days ahead. Or if something needs to just drop from our memory because it won't be useful, I pray that your Spirit would help us to do that. Father, help us, Lord, to be people who love your word and know how to handle it rightly. That's our desire. That's our prayer in this class. And as we seek to be Christians who live wise lives, using your word in our lives and with others around us. For it's in Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen.